Welcome to the Quality Online Course Series, Course Content and Instructional Materials. If you're familiar with the Quality Matters rubric and standards, this particular workshop really aligns with the Quality Matters Standard 4. My name is Tracy Miller, and I'm the Online Teaching Coordinator at the Northern Illinois University's Faculty Development and Instructional Design Center. And so I will be your facilitator this afternoon for the next 55 minutes or so. I see Kenny just joined us. Welcome to another session. Glad to see you here. My workshop objectives for today is that you will be able to discover and create content and instructional materials which contribute to your course learning objectives. That's probably the primary reason everyone is here this afternoon, but I do have another objective. I hope you'll be able to communicate the nature and use of the course content instructional materials. So this particular session will be broken down into sort of these two parts. So we will dive right in and start talking about how we can create and discover some content. So discover and create. Discover I always like to start with because we need to think about the content that we're going to use in our course, and it really does start with that discovery before any creation begins. So let's talk about what I mean by content and instructional materials specific for online courses. So it really could be a variety of things. Textbooks, articles, anything you put on eReserve. That we often do start with selecting that textbook that we're going to use in our course. But it also could be any videos or multimedia that we're going to use. Online courses especially are such a rich environment because we can embed videos and all kinds of multimedia. And then we also may be discovering or creating some sort of lecture or presentations in our course. All of these things are our content and our instructional materials. But we could also incorporate any sort of internet resources we find or even tutorials, really depending on the type of discipline that the course is addressing. So that's what I'm talking about when I say course content or instructional materials. So how do you know? This is a discussion. Add your thoughts into the text chat area. How do you know which type of equipment to use? Which type of instructional materials, not equipment? No ideas yet? Sometimes I'm impatient when I'm asking questions, and what I really need is just to give people time to write some responses. And I see that's exactly what Ashley's done. I usually base it on my past experiences in online classes and choose the equipment that worked best for me. And that is a good way. I did misspeak when I said equipment, but I'm going to kind of translate that answer into what I think might make sense here. And that's maybe the different types of instructional materials you choose might be reflective in past experiences that you've had. Sailor says, depends on the kind of engagement you want with students. Yeah, it may definitely depend on your teaching style that you want to kind of use with your students. Kenny said, based on the instructional materials being learned and the way you are trying to deliver it. And so you've kind of wrapped a lot of things into this, Kenny, including the one that I think is the baseline for me. And it said the instructional material being learned. And so really what it is you need to start with your learning objectives. What do you want your students to be learning, and what do you want them to be able to do upon the completion of your course? So instructional materials really need to align with those course learning objectives. So what do you want them to be able to do by the end of the course? And any module level objectives that you have. So what do you want them to be able to do by the end of the week? Any of that kind of instructional material really needs to support those learning objectives. So in this example I have here on the screen, I have a learning example that students will be able to identify examples of formative and summative evaluations. That's one of my learning objectives for sort of this course that I'm using as an example here. And it is an evaluation course. So what can I find that will really help the students be able to identify examples? And so let's just say that I found a YouTube video that I looked over, and it looks like this would be some really great instructional materials for students to be able to, again, achieve these learning objectives. So if you've been to some of my workshops before, you might have noticed that I don't normally add this little thing down at the bottom where it says this slide contributes to the achievement of the workshop objective, discover and create content and instructional materials which contribute to your course learning objective. I'm just being a little bit more intentional in letting you know, because you're my students right now, and I want to make sure that I address the learning objectives. So I'm letting you know how this particular slide, which is an instructional material, how it aligns with that learning objective. So again, we don't normally do that. We're just being a little over obvious for this particular workshop. So the next piece is you think you've got this really great instructional material, and you've identified it based off of a learning objective that you have, but you really want to make sure that how are you going to measure that that learning objective really was useful to your students obtaining the learning objective. And that's going to be through your assessments. So we have an entirely different workshop on assessments, but I just think it's worth mentioning that these things all need to align or fit together. And so you're starting with your learning objectives. You're figuring out that instructional material that's really going to help them meet that learning objective. And finally, you're kind of going to reconfirm your suspicions that this is a good resource, or maybe not, through the assessments. Okay, so I always like to kind of check in, but I also like to use different checkpoints when I'm designing an online course to really make sure that everything's fitting in, because you're not just picking out one YouTube video. You're not just using one chapter in your textbook. You're probably going to have a variety of instructional materials, and you want to make sure everything is covered. So I like to use this, this kind of table that I create. And what I do is I put module level objectives in column 1 and create these different rows. So I have 4 different module level objectives kind of down the first column here. And the different instructional materials that I pick out, I put across the top row. Just some sort of general categories of instructional materials. And then I simply make these sort of X marks in various different spots to make sure that I am covering those learning objectives, but also that there's sort of a variety, a bunch of different kind of instructional materials that I'm adding in the course. So this checkpoint is allowing me to find gaps, or maybe a saturation. If everything is sort of all textbook all the time, then I may not be adding the variety I want in the course. And we will definitely talk about variety too. But variety is really important. Certain students, different students respond to different types of course content. And because an online course just gives you so many options, it's just a really good practice to try to incorporate that variety. So let me ask you, how do you currently find your course content or instructional materials? And if you're more of a teaching assistant, even give me an idea of what you suspect might be happening when your instructors are picking out their course content. And you can just add that into the text chat area. And you know I'm going to give you my thoughts on how I think you should find it. Cheryl says, from similar courses and other programs in schools. That's a really good one. I like that. I don't hear that as often as you would think. But really, you have that ability. Look at what are others doing and kind of tapping into that. Probably viewing other courses similar. Similar answer. Bill says past knowledge, experience in the subject. Google search for topics, recommendations for colleagues. A lot of good ideas in there. Bill, especially when you do have a lot of experience, you begin to sort of recognize those great resources quicker because you kind of know what to look for. So great answer. Don says all of those plus others in the field. Yeah, sometimes you're looking at other experts in the field and what they're kind of pointing you in the right direction. The course content I use is from a program called Connect through McGraw-Hill. Yeah, and that is actually using published content, and we can definitely tap into that. Still good ideas here. Amanda says library search. Kenny says a lot of course content for the publishers. So again, talking about the publisher content. Amanda, hold that idea because I'm going to show you something new with the library search. So one of the ways you can discover instructional materials is, of course, all of the above that you talked about. But I also want to introduce you to open educational resources if that's a new term for you. And that's the idea that a lot of our colleagues, a lot of people in the field have began to share their content in this open educational environment where they're actually sharing their content, and it's just ours to be discovered. And so there's some resources out there that you can find. There's OER, which is Open Educational Resources, commons.org. There's Creative Commons that you can actually discover, use that to discover and search for content in your particular discipline, in your field. Merlot, yes, Merlot is definitely a standout one. The advantages to these are not only are they actually available to you, but you can also find out if you are allowed to use them. So I'm pointing over here to this Creative Commons attribution. And in this case, this is a very open attribution. They're really letting folks around the world use this content in any way they want. Sometimes it'll tell you you can't use it for commercial purposes, or you can use it, but you can't adapt it to your own, add your own voice or something like that to it. You know, in this case, it says here, no strings attached. So they're letting you use it in any way you want. Another advantage to open educational resources is that you can see who the provider is. You know, if you see something like the provider is Rice University, you have that confidence that this is probably a quality instructional material rather than, you know, content being provided by, you know, a student or somebody that really may not have any business in creating educational content. So I invite you to explore more about open, open educational resources. Um, any other online resources. And I have an asterisk next to this because you do want to be careful, right? We want to be educated consumers. When we share resources with our student, we want to make sure it's factual, and then all of those other things that we just talked about. We want to make sure that we are able to share this with our student, that the creator, the author, has given us permission to do so. We also want to make sure that it's accessible to our students. And so I just caution, when you look for online resources, that you think about some of these other characteristics of the resources. I'm going to give you sort of an evaluation checklist to be able to make some good choices when you find online resources. University resources, not just our colleagues, which we talked about, but there may be other support units or perhaps a research unit or something that would be a great resource for you. And then, yes, we talked about textbook and publisher content. Uh, Textbook publishers see the writing on the wall, that they have to be a little bit more creative than just producing textbooks and charging $300 for them. So publisher content is getting better and better and being more useful to us. But I will say, if you've been to this particular workshop before, I always try to add new things that I find. I recently went to a workshop at NIU's university libraries, and they introduced me to an open textbook library that we are now part of, sort of a consortium of this idea of having an open textbook. So that would be free textbooks for students. Or for you to use with your students, because a real issue with students is that price of the textbooks. It can be, you know, just astronomical, and it's really hard for students. So just to make your course more accessible financially for students, this open textbook library is really a great resource. So the librarians and the subject matter experts at NIU told me that if you would like to use an open textbook, I just added the link into the text chat area. Talk to your subject matter expert, and they will help you potentially find this open free textbook for your course. I'm super excited when I hear about new initiatives like this. I touched on it briefly when I kind of went over those valuable attributes to using an open educational resource. But here are some considerations when selecting your instructional materials. The first one we've already talked about a lot. The content should be relevant to those learning objectives. If you're using a textbook, for instance, and it has 40 chapters in it, do not feel compelled to go through all 40 chapters. pick out those chapters that are relevant to your learning objectives. When you go through that checkpoint that I went over, if you're finding that there is certain types of content that you've always used, but it's really not lining up with a learning objective, maybe it's time to kind of cull that out of your instructional materials. The next thing to consider is that make sure the content that you find represents up-to-date thinking or practices in your discipline. Some content, some journal articles, even an old version of that textbook may not represent that up-to-date thinking any longer. And so you need to kind of make it part of your practice to kind of update your content from time to time. I've got a couple little sub-bullets under here. Yes, it should be current. However, there are just some pieces of work that are historical or seminal. So that doesn't mean that you always have to find the most recent article. If it's something that you know that's seminal, it stood the test of time, then certainly keep that instructional material in your course. Content should be varied and offer multiple perspective. Touched on that a little bit a few slides ago. That it should represent different voices. It's always a good idea to maybe have some contrasting voices on different topics. And you also might consider different modalities. So, is it a video? Is it just something you're going to read? Is it something that's blended, like a blog post that may have videos, texts, graphs, anything that can kind of offer that different modality helps the students, again, kind of tap into what works best for them. So make sure those are some things that you are considering. Okay, time for another discussion. What's missing on what we've just covered with discovering content and what you might want to consider? Again, we might have some typers in there, but I'll kind of get the ball rolling here. I think the major thing that's missing, at least in my workshop at this point, is that we haven't really heard from the instructor yet. We've done a lot of discovering. We've talked about diverse voices, but we also want to consider that instructor voice when we're designing our online course. So what role are we going to have in the course? How are the students going to hear my perspective? And so I think that's why I like to discover first and then try to maybe fill in those gaps with my voice. Donna was just going to mention instructor videos and writing. Yes, absolutely. Because online students can feel isolated, and if they feel like their instructors are not there, that it can feel really robotic, and that instructor voice really needs to be there. So this idea of filling in the gaps, and here's sort of my scenario here. We've discovered some great videos. They met all of our requirements, some really current, great new articles. Everything's kind of being outlined by a textbook. So over here on the right-hand side, I just kind of filled in what it might look like in your course. So I've got a video that I found on open educational resources. I've got some journal articles that I've linked down here below. But I've realized that I'm sort of missing in here. So that way, now I'm going to create some presentations. I might host a live synchronous session, like the session we're doing here today. Or I might even create a faculty blog. I think a blog is really interesting too because you can use that multiple modality. But I'm going to let the students know perhaps how I think all of this instructional material fits together. If I have introduced to some kind of contrasting journal articles, I might synthesize that for them or draw them to specific points I'm looking at. All of that can then be done through creation of, again, some presentations, some other sessions, or a variety of tools. Dawn said writing. Sometimes you're just going to write out maybe a welcome text that's just going to let the students know your thoughts on this week's topic. I promised a table or a way that you can kind of evaluate instructional materials that you come across, maybe even instructional materials that you are creating. So the first thing you want to look at is the learning objectives. How do these instructional materials really fall out in these different categories? And then, if you're looking at them and they're in this below expectations range, that might be your clue to kind of look for a different resource or beef up your own created content a little bit. Do you have that variety you're looking for? Or does the variety need to be kind of enhanced? Maybe the variety is honestly too much. You also don't want to give them so many different types of content that they're struggling week to week just to kind of figure out how to use the content. Is it current, historical, or seminal, or relevant? This really gets down to that relevancy. And then finally, is the content copyright permissive? And is it accessible to your students? And really, in many of these ways, if you're tapping on this below expectations, then you really want to look for different instructional materials. At the top, I have Creative Commons licensed this particular table. It's my creation, but I am allowing you to use it as long as you don't use it for commercial purposes. Okay, so we are switching gears now. We're going to start talking about instructional materials from the perspective of our second workshop objective today, which is communication or communicating some aspects of our instructional materials to our students. So just as a reminder of what our course objectives are, I've highlighted it in red this time. Okay, so why do you use the instructional materials that you do? And very similar to the first question I asked, so I'm not going to make you go through it in the text chat area. But again, the correct answer is because they support the students in achieving the learning objectives. And so it's important that you let them know what the purpose is. And that's why I've followed this up with this question of, do your students know why you chose this particular instructional material? And if you provide them with that purpose and give them that relevancy, it really helps them in, again, achieving those learning objectives. So you really want to include a short description for each assigned content item. It can be very brief. It can be just as simple as read chapter 3. This will help you in this week's quiz and also help you in the discussion board we're going to have next week. We're showing that alignment, being really intentional about it. You can even be more specific. Maybe you're going to let them know that there's 3 key concepts that you want them to really focus in on. And so providing them with that description and that purpose of the instructional materials has these following benefits here. It helps the student understand why you put the course together the way you did, and that increases satisfaction. This is what the research has shown us. It motivates the students to review the material. WIFM, it's what's in it for me. You're letting them know exactly why you would like them to review the materials. And so if you suspect they're not reading something and they're doing poorly on the assessments, let them know how they fit together. And it just helps the students. And then establish any connections between topics. In my example of, review this material, it will help you in next week's discussion. Maybe there's another concept that you're going to introduce in that next week, and now you're going to let the students know how they fit together. Another way you can do that, I've got some samples here, and we talked about the short descriptions. Post it right with the assigned materials. So it's kind of that just-in-time description. It may be buried in the syllabus somewhere that they read the first week, but my suggestion is that you add those descriptions right where the material, they're going to find their material in the course. Explain the purpose at the beginning of a recorded or live presentation. So that's another way of doing it. You're not creating a text of the purpose, but when you do start that recorded presentation or lecture, you begin with this is why I'm talking to you this afternoon about this subject matter, because it's really going to solidify the topics that we're going to cover in Chapter 7. Just let them know up front. That's that direct communication, quick and to the point. And then you could also let them know sort of an overall of the purpose of the assigned materials in a weekly introduction video. That's something that I like to do with my students, where I'm just generally letting them know how the week is going and why I chose particular materials. And it puts my face in front of them so that they know that I've made those decisions, but they can also see that there's a person behind there kind of making those decisions. Okay, so I'm going to create a poll, kind of wake us all up again. Do you include optional content that's kind of outside the scope? I'm going to put a 4-choice poll up on the screen. So 1, 2, 3, 4 is going to be A, B, C, D. I can see responses coming in. There's a lot of choice 4, which is both B and C. So to refresh them on prerequisites and also to provide opportunities to expand their learning. And there's also quite a few for providing opportunities to expand learning. So I'm going to say that that is a pretty typical response and a very good reason for providing your students with optional content. Sometimes you also ask your students to suggest content, and then they are to share it with the rest of the students. The important part when designing an online course is to be really intentional about the content being optional. You know, and we'll talk about some ways that you can do that. But here's some really good reasons why you would want to add some prerequisite content. Um, it can help students make up some work that may not have been covered in high school, or if they've transferred from a different college. You know, it's not always our role to make sure that they get caught up. But if it's something where we can provide them with a resource that's now going to help them meet our learning objectives, we want to be able to do that. It could provide a refresher. Or they may be in a slightly different field, and any kind of optional content is going to help them again be at the spot that they need to be. And then it's going to help any relearning of material. Maybe they're going to see they've seen the material before, but they've never really had to apply it or use it in this particular way. So all some great reasons to give them that prerequisite material. So we got a lot of answers. C for extended learning. So everyone should be kind of familiar with these reasons. But it also can just give them that multiple voice. Somebody somewhere just explained something in a really great, simple way. And they're going to really benefit from hearing it in a different way, especially if it's complex material that may break it down for them a little bit more. It also allows students to explore a topic in more detail. So if there's something that you sort of introduce, but you don't really need to dig deep into, students still have this opportunity to do that with the idea of optional content. It'll help students to become experts by having them find resources and share them with classmates. That's kind of that extra reason I mentioned earlier. We're trying to help our students be really critical when they're finding resources. And that's more of a life skill. But if they can share it with their classmates, even better. And then it also can give you the opportunity to incorporate any current events or recent findings. So if you already have your course designed and you've come up with some really good content, but then something relevant comes up, and you want to incorporate it into your course, make it optional. I was recently looking at a course where it was talking about ethics and public health, and they really wanted to talk about the soda tax in Chicago. So, you know, you can't totally rebuild your course based off of the soda tax in Chicago, but it was certainly relevant to their course. So you can definitely add it as optional materials. But the most important part is to be really clear about the distinction between required and optional content. So the students focus on the required materials, and they may make some time for the optional content. So here's some ways you can do it. You can create a completely different folder for it or menu item, you know, adding it over into the left-hand navigation in Blackboard. Very clear in the label, this is optional materials. You can specifically identify a list of assigned materials. And so there's definitely a list for assigned materials, that required material, and then maybe a separate list for that optional material. Or you can consistently identify in the title or description of the materials. So an asterisk. Any material that has an asterisk next to it could be that optional material. In this case, I have an example where you have the title to the material, and then next to it in parentheses, it says optional. So there's no question between the two. And that helps the students not get bogged down by worrying about what's required and what's optional. Give them more cognitive space to focus on that content. So the next kind of identification is to use an academic citation format which is suitable for your discipline when you introduce your materials. And let me tell you why. One of the reasons is because you are modeling that behavior. You may be asking your students to write papers, you may be asking them to respond to discussion boards, and you're going to tell them, you know, you need to back up your argument by citing your materials. And when they're citing the materials, they need to formally, academically cite them, so you're modeling that behavior. The other thing is it makes it easier for them to find those materials if they need to find them from an additional resource. You know, if you've added them to the library in a folder and they can pick up copies, but they're actually in California and they're going to need to find the materials on their own. First of all, make sure they do have access to those materials, but it's really easier to find them if it's cited the way it should be. And again, it demonstrates your commitment to academic integrity. You're acknowledging the creator and the author of these work. And so any way you can model that practice is important to your students. So when you find those materials, make sure you cite them properly. If they're more of a freelance YouTube video, then you may not find that academic citation, but do your best to give them all of the information so that they know where these sources are coming from. When you are communicating instructional materials to your students, use a consistent structure. So think about what that structure is ahead of time, but then when you're actually developing the course, go back and make sure that, for instance, it's always added in as an item, and you're kind of maybe putting the academic citation first, then your brief description, and then a link to the resource. Whatever it is that you come up with, it's just important that you have that consistent structure. We already talked about using any kind of academic citation format. Help your students to understand and why and how to use the instructional materials. We talked a lot about the why. Let's talk a little bit about the how. So do you want them to read through the materials? Do you want them to make annotations on the materials? Should they review it quickly and then go back and look for answers to questions they may have? Or do you want them to review the instructional materials and then reflect on them in a journal? Let them know how, it's almost like you're giving them some study skills. How are they going to use these instructional materials? Could be a material that is more of a practice, something that they're going to do a little practice with. Again, whatever you can tell them, clearly communicate how they're going to use the instructional materials. And then this is almost like a recap. So make sure that they are designated by a required or an optional material. Sometimes I will discover that confusion between the required and optional material because I see my students asking it in a question and answer forum. So they're sort of consistently asking me, do I really need to read this? Do I really need to watch this? And so that's my clue that in the design of the course, I need to be just much more clear on how I'm communicating with the students on it. So here's my example on how you can really do a lot of this in one kind of big chunk. I'm a visual person, so I can really appreciate when this is sort of all diagrammed out for me. In the left-hand bracket over here, I said a consistent structure for each module. So you want to make sure week to week your instructional materials are presented in a consistent way. So I've got this identifier at the top that it's a textbook rating. It is properly cited this is APA format. So it would be whatever discipline that you have. It should be represented in the citation style. This next one, this guidance for reading, this is where I'm giving them some relevancy and purpose. I said focus on chapter 10 as it is more practical of the two. So in this case, I've told the students that they need to read chapters 4 and 10, but then I'm giving them a little bit more purpose, a little bit more guidance in telling them, you know what, if you're going to spend a little bit more time, focus in on chapter 10. I really think it's more practical. Next, really specific about what I mean about optional. Recommended, not required. And I've seen some optional material labeled as recommended. And recommended always seems a little in that gray zone to me, where, well, isn't it all recommended? You know, what's required? So any more clear communication, more detail you can give your students, it's great. But you can see it's not a ton of work. I'm just kind of putting these little parentheses, but being really intentional about what I mean. And so then I've got some more, some extension or prerequisite information that they may want to tap into. And it all kind of comes together and the students understand why this instructional material is important, what I think is most important, where they can find it if they need to kind of look on their own. It's all in this one paragraph. So whenever I do these workshops, and we're drawing into the close here, I like to wrap up how this really aligns with the Quality Matters standards for those folks that are more involved with Quality Matters. So what we're talking about this afternoon in one big sentence is quality courses use current, historical, or seminal instructional materials that support the learning objectives through diverse voices and multiple modalities, with clearly communicated purpose and use and proper citations, and are obvious in their distinction between required and optional materials. So again, if you are familiar with the QM standards, these little notes next to them, 4.1, 4.5, those are considered specific review standards, and that is what we've been unpacking in the last hour. I do a 1 hour online workshop that covers all of the general standards, and so I really like to break down each one into these more concrete pieces with some really practical applications for using it. So I hope I've addressed many of the things that you were hoping to get out of today's session. In summary, I think I've introduced a lot of different kinds of instructional materials, but also really honed in on the importance of them supporting your learning objectives. We talked a lot about using a variety of instructional materials, both found and created. And then, that second half where we talked about how we are going to communicate the instructional materials, include the purpose of citation and whether it was required or optional. I'm open to questions now. So if anyone has any particular questions for me, again, my name is Tracy Miller, and I'm the online teaching coordinator. Here is my email address. But again, I'm happy to stay a few more minutes and answer questions, or just shoot me an email, and I will be happy to sit down and talk to you about any of these options. I do want to talk a little bit, if folks are typing, about our survey. I'm sending out a link to the survey that goes along with this particular workshop. I love to get feedback from folks and kind of change things up for the next time we do this workshop together. Also maybe hearing about what other topics you might want to talk about. But I will be sending out a recording of this workshop with my follow-up email. So if you'd like to go back and kind of review what we talked about earlier, you will have that option to do so.